I did put some stuff out to kind of, oh, I forgot I was supposed to be mic'd up, so is that better? Okay, so just tell you a little bit about how this came about. Is we decided to do the board meeting in Charlotte for the public hearing on the rules, and for those of you that watch rulemaking for several times, you know that sometimes the rules are kind of controversial, and they garner a lot of response. Even the last batch we had involving Perea and all that, but this time, most of these rules had to be done. We don't really have a choice. There are AQB requirements and a few technical changes that just needed to be cleaned up. So there's really nothing that the appraisal population is very in arms about or not wanting us to do. So, but we have to go through this process every time we do rulemaking. We have to have a public hearing and allow time for comment. And so that met that requirement. We thought, well, maybe if we bring it, we talked about doing a remote meeting in another part of the state. We get some people to attend a meeting that haven't been able to come to Raleigh, and so we'll study how this went and possibly do it again, either farther west or toward the coast, and just to try to do. I don't know if it'll be annually or every 18 months or so, but I do think that it's not a bad idea to get out every once in a while and try to allow people that aren't going to don't really need to take the time to come all the way to Raleigh for a 2 hour and a half, 2 hour meeting to come to town. So, but when we decided to do this, we know about how long our meetings have been taking. A lot of you attend, several of them know they're running about an hour at most. And we didn't think the hearing would take long, so I was talking to Graham at a meeting in Washington. We talked about, we do a thing called a training town hall where we answer questions for trainees and supervisors. And I said, well, we may not have that many trainees or supervisors, so we could do kind of a general town hall and we could cover some trainee issues, but we could also cover just general items that the board deals with. And I've done a presentation, as for those of you who were here this morning heard me say, I did a presentation for the farm managers and one for the Appraisal Institute. And so I'm going to go through some of the information that I did for them. And then, like I said, I would really like to just take some time and let some questions, maybe misconceptions, anything that you have about the board, we could, we'll deal with that. I mean, we kind of plan on this being up to about 90 minutes long, but if it's, we get through in 45 minutes to an hour and nobody has any more questions, we'll wrap it up, but we'll just go from there. And Brandy's going to kind of go through some things dealing with upgrades and competency issues and issues that we see when people submit work to us, both from kind of the complaint side and the upgrade side. So, but we'll, for those of you who have not met Brandy, this is Brandy March, our Deputy Director. She's been with us since December of 22, so about almost a year and a half. And so she was the Director of the Appraisal Program in Iowa before she came here, and we're fortunate to have her, and she does a lot of, she kind of manages the caseload in terms of the investigators and what all they get assigned to, and the input from their complaints. Also, when you submit applications for upgrade, she's making sure all the boxes are checked from the AQB standpoint. She does a lot more things too, as I was joking with, it wasn't joking, but I was telling Graham about, I had a PowerPoint for that farm managers meeting, and she definitely did that, because I wouldn't have been accused of putting that together. So some of these slides were derived from that presentation. But we'll just go from there. So one of the things I get asked about every time that I do any kind of speaking engagement is, how many appraisers do we have in North Carolina? How many do we have in each different category or credential level? As of April 1st, which is just a few days ago, We had 619 trainees, 142 licensed residential, 1,381 certified residential, and I think that's reversed. I think it's 1,850 certified residential. I believe it is. I believe we have certified. I think we have more residential general, so those numbers I think got transposed. But that's so in all you're running right at 4,000 total credential holders. But the general and the certified residential have stayed very stable for probably 7 to 10 years. I mean, that number just does not fluctuate a whole lot. The trainees bounces a lot. You heard Mr. Ibach mention this morning how we've lost about 200 trainees in the last 12 months or so, 12, 18 months. And a lot of that is because of, you have people upgrade, you have people that decided this wasn't for them. But it is true, we also see people that they couldn't get a supervisor, there's not a path forward, and they decide to let their credential go. And some of them may come back. They have, as long as their education's within the last 5 years, they can come back fairly easily. So that is, but we have seen that number drop off a good bit. So if you look at, so just talking a little more about licensing, as you know, to upgrade from any credential, from a registered trainee or up to licensed, or from licensed to certified or certified general, you have to have pre-licensing education, which is our appraisal classes. You also have to have a certain amount of experience over a minimum amount of time. So, so if you have, for example, I think with certified licensed residential, you have to have 1,000 hours in no less than 6 months. Licensed residential, 1,500 hours for certified residential in no less than a year, and then 2,500 in no less than 18 months for certified general. Now, I used to do this all the time. Now I don't do it as much. You can tell it starts to fade. But that is, so when you submit an application, and Brandy will talk a little more about that process, we evaluate that you have the requisite courses, look at the certificates, and then you have to have the amount of time and hours, and then for certified residential, certified general, there is a college component, and you have to have met that. So we're checking all of that prior to issuing you what we call an exam authorization form, or we call it an exam ticket. And so when you get your exam ticket from the board, then currently you have up to 1 year or 5 takes, whichever comes first. So, and you can take it no more often than every 30 days. Now, there was a rule proposed in what went forward today that is what the AQB requirement is, and it basically says once we give that credential or that exam ticket, it's good for 2 years. And they don't put a limit on the number of takes. We're going to leave in the part that says you can only take it every 30 days. So effectively, I guess you could take it 23 or 4 times in a 2-year period. If you can't pass it in 24 times, you might want to look at something else to do for a living. But that's, but we have seen that. But we get asked, and I brought that up today, what the exam results are like. If you look at the bottom of the handout, this page, you have that's the national exam statistics from the Appraisal Foundation. Now, a lot of people don't realize the exam is written by the AQB. They hire subject matter experts. They develop questions. They decide, they have psychometricians, I think they call it, and that do studies and all, and decide which questions remain in the exam, which ones get kicked out for being too hard or being too easy. And then, over time, you get new questions in the bank, so to speak. So if you look at this chart, you can see the pass rate from 2019 through 2023, and you can see it runs for licensed residential between a low of 57% to a high of 64% in that time period. Certified residential kind of even more consistent from 62 to 65%. Certified general from 50 to 55 or 57%. And it gives you a total around in the 60% range. So then if you flip over and look, you get North Carolina specific for the last 2 years, and you see the pass rate is actually maybe running just a little bit higher just for those time periods, in the mid-60s in 22 for all categories, and from 50 to 70%, 50 for general, 66 for residential, and 70 for licensed in 2023. Now, as most of you taking statistics, the smaller the sample size skews the numbers. So, if you only have a dozen people take it, one more pass or one more fail shifts it dramatically. I mentioned to the board today, we were looking at 4 months. Dana called me out and said that there was a 52% pass rate, only 5 people took it, and 2 passed. How did they get 52%? Well, that was the national rate, and as I was mentioning, 2 people passed is 40%, 3 people passed is 60%. So it shifts dramatically just with one number. But this lets you know that this is a national exam. It's based on the core content that's in the criteria developed by AQB. We have, some people can't believe when I tell them this, the board has no input to the exam. Matter of fact, we can't even see the exam. It's from a security standpoint reason, it's totally controlled by AQB. The only thing the board does with the exam is we decide which testing company we're going to contract with, and we've been with Pearson VUE ever since I've been here. There's only really 2 nationwide, and so it's either Pearson VUE or Promisor. We don't have enough volume where we get people wanting to compete for the business. So we kind of had to always contract with them. But whatever they charge at any given time for the exam goes directly to them. That's not part of the application fee. None of that is taken by the board or anything. So that's all done. But that is how the exam works. Just in case you were wondering. Any questions on that part? Like I said, we'll talk about the upgrade process a little more. Randy will talk about that. Any questions about how the exam works itself? Go ahead.
Do you track how many of the trainees actually have a supervisor or not?
We did look into it a little bit during COVID, trying to kind of at least see which ones we had actually gotten a supervisor declaration form for, and we were running a little north of 50% at that time. It does kind of ebb and flow, and then of course you have people upgrade that don't necessarily report at the time they upgrade that they moved up, and we don't have any way of knowing if they're active or not. Like, even if they say they have a supervisor, are they actively looking for a supervisor? Are they actively working with a supervisor even though they sent one in? I mean, we just don't have any. It's just like if you have a credential to be certified or whatever, we don't know if you're doing any work. We just know that you're certified to do so. There's some people that think we actually house all the appraisals done in North Carolina, and we have a way of tracking all that, but it's not, we don't do that. So they want us to check our database for that appraisal, and I'm like, we don't get all the appraisals in.
So
Second part.
looking at the numbers, so the question this morning was the number of trainees that reduced by 200 since the last few steps.
Yeah, I think the last couple of cycles.
In 2022 to now, that's 152 that passed in North Carolina. Do y'all know how many of those are upgrades versus like trainees getting a credential versus upgraded from residential to general?
Yeah, I mean,
to certified?
yeah, we obviously we don't know. I mean, we could probably track some of that, but it would be, we'd have to get it down on a granular level. There's nothing that like prints out.
Because I mean, that just, that number cuts it down a whole lot of, from if they were all trainees moving to a certified or licensed or whatever.
And
that kind of just shows the, those people step off, there's replacements coming in.
And the one statistic that I can kind of say that has been fairly stable over time is we usually run, when we do renewals in the spring, it runs somewhere between 92-94% of all the credentials we have renewed for a cycle. And that has been fairly stable, not for a whole time here. Now, what happened this time was we did get a bigger bump down because, you had almost 25% of trainees not renewed. And like you said, some of them certainly upgraded, some of them chose to not. And it's also a lot easier to come back as a trainee than coming back in any of the other credential levels. So it's, like I said, as long as your education hasn't timed out, you cannot really start over. You can kind of clean the slate and start over by just filing a new application. But if you're trying to keep your credential and at the level you are, then you have to make sure your CE's caught up and they'll do all that. When the trainee can kind of almost just say, well, I'm starting over. So there's not there's not as much incentive for somebody to keep their credential, as long as they're moving up. So anything else on that?
I had one more on the licensing numbers.
Sure.
So out of the 4,000 total, how many are out of state versus in the state?
That number is between 700 and 800. So I wish I had a breakdown for you, but it's and that is people that reside in another state today. That's not necessarily how they got their credential. That's where they are today. That's the one thing we can check pretty quick is where you reside. But there are people obviously that reside in North Carolina that came in by reciprocity from another state. There are people that got their exam in North Carolina, got reciprocity and moved away. So, but as of right now, that many people reside elsewhere. I will say that the highest percentage of out of state are certainly generals, because many generals have multiple licenses, especially, they tend to appraise properties regionally or whether it be for maybe a hotel corporation, a restaurant corporation, whatever, and they do a lot of work like that. So, but we've seen, I mentioned this morning, there's some people that have 25, 26 credentials, and they'll call me and they say, I have somebody on my staff that all they do is keep up with my CE. I'm like, well, that's, that's part of it if you want to take on that many credentials. So. All right, just moving on to complaints. We'll talk about that a little bit. So we, if you look at that bar chart, you see how many complaints we've had for the last, this is the 5th year basically since COVID. So had 95 in 2020. Of course, we had about 4 or 5 months in the middle there where the world was shut down, so we were kind of, they kept that number kind of low in 2020. 2021, 137, 2022, 119, last year 131, and fortunately today, as of the year, we've only had 12. So that's good that we're definitely glad to see that number down. If you look at the chart with the multicolored bars at the bottom, that shows you where complaints are coming from mainly. As you see, you have AMCs are a very small number of actual complaints. The board itself, what that means is either you may have heard, if you were at the meeting this morning, we did an investigation request dealing with applications to upgrade based on, so that those will be categorized as open by the board. Then you have consumer complaints, which is property owners, homeowners, GSEs, government-sponsored enterprises, which is the Fannie Mae, Freddie Mac. Most of you that have followed the board closely for the last few years have heard me say that, that's been the biggest source of complaints lately. We're seeing a lot of them from those entities, primarily Fannie Mae. We've had, I think, a handful of Freddie Mac over the whole time, but one or two. So then, of course, you have lenders, peers, which are other appraisers, and brokers, real estate professionals. So that's the main categories. So you see where most of our complaints come from. Just again, when I first came to the board as an investigator, I thought, well, everybody's complaining about properties being too low, and it's homeowner complaints. Well, that is kind of where we are now from a consumer standpoint. When the early 2000s through about 2006, 7, when the crash started, we were seeing more appraisals are hitting the number, appraisal, mortgage fraud, things like that, and appraisal tied to it. Not so much of that anymore. We're seeing more, it's about the value. Now, with the GSEs, their complaints are not always about anything to do with the value. They're citing specific issues with, comp selection, with, comparables aren't similar, condition adjustments aren't supported, quality adjustments aren't supported, things like that. So either unsupported or poorly chosen comparables. And again, the first few we saw of these, it appeared to be maybe just rural properties where the appraiser didn't have much to work with, and once we looked into it, it didn't seem to be a lot there. But over time, it seems like their process of screening these has improved, and we're seeing at least some substantiation of the allegations that come forward. Now, it doesn't mean that, I've heard people use the term, that doesn't mean we put them in appraisal jail, but it means that sometimes there's at least some sort of correction, whether it be a letter of warning, a conditional dismissal with a class, or obviously if it's continued behavior, something more severe like a reprimand or even a suspension. So that's kind of how we get there. And of course, there's a pie chart there that shows some. Any question about the complaints we get, the process, anything that I can address, Steve?
When it comes to GSE complaints, on that pie chart is showing 56% of all complaints in 2023 from the GSE originated. Those 56%, approximately how much percent were found to be not worthy of a complaint?
We're probably a little too early to make that call because we're still in the middle of 2023 complaints being resolved right now. So, but I would say, we don't have, it's not the statistic we keep up with, but we don't have a ton of straight dismissals. Usually there's at least some, you know, at least something to caution an appraiser about or remind them about, and that's, but as most of you know, it's a high percentage that either get a warning letter or a warning letter with a class, and that's the term we've always used since I came on board, probably in 2005-ish, is steered CE. So in other words, the way it's always worked in the past, if you get dismissed with a class, this course you take gets counted toward your CE requirement. So it's just you're taking this class rather than just, you know, whatever you've taken in the past. Maybe you've taken the same, you know, manufactured housing class 3 cycles in a row just because they teach it at your favorite barbecue restaurant or whatever. I mean, you know, whatever reason you choose to pick a certain class. You know, we say it might be more useful if you take, you know, a class in appraiser reliability or highest and best use or comparable sale adjustments or such.
So of all the complaints, over the years, I've only seen one appraiser ever lose their license. And so I'm just kind of curious, are we missing a lot of them, or is it?
I don't think you see a lot nationally get revoked unless sometimes you'll see somebody, they get kind of backed in a corner, they'll surrender their license, which is effectively the same thing. It's just we didn't, you know,
Force them.
usually a revocation is going to come to a hearing, it's going to be contested, and you're going to, so if it gets resolved somewhere on the front end, but yeah, you'll see, sometimes you'll see a lengthy suspension, sometimes you'll see, we haven't done this lately, but if you look in some of the older appraiser reports, you will see appraisers that were required to retest. And I've had some people say, I'll give them up before I'll retest. So, I mean, you know, so there is, when a consent order is reached, that gives the board and the appraiser some latitude in trying to reach some sort of agreement. North Carolina, for those of you that don't know, we do not have the ability to fine an appraiser. So we can't, like, if you go to, I think, Georgia or some other states nearby, Virginia, I believe, they can, you know, you'll see they got a $1,000 fine in this, and you know, and whether or not that's deemed disciplinary action by the board, that's their decision, and if it is discipline, then it gets uploaded to the registry, just like in North Carolina, we consider anything above a reprimand disciplinary action. That does get reported to the subcommittee. Now, if it doesn't affect your ability to work, they don't put it on what they call the national report to all the lenders and things. But it shows, it's tagged as other or whatever, and that they know that they can look to that state to find out whatever happened. So then we get contacted and say, you know, I see there was some action taken against, you know, Mike Warren's license, and you know, I want to know what it is, and then of course that's public record.
So you would say that, like, out of all the complaints, a very small percentage ever get their license
Taken away. Yes, I mean, that is, now, going back, like I said, when we were in the mortgage fraud days, they were more frequent. They weren't, I still wouldn't say it was a high number, but it was definitely, we had more active suspensions, we had more, because, you know, you could tell they were trying to, you know, they were steering to a number, or they were misleading the client, missing, like, you know, tracking the ownership from one person to, you know, you're missing where some flips were taking place. There was like gifts that were, you know, to help make down payments and things, and all this wasn't being analyzed as part of the contract. And sometimes it was just they didn't know better. They didn't know how to look for it, and they were naive. And then sometimes they were in. So, you know, we found this goes way back. So I don't think any of the parties that this appraiser happened to go to jail. for taking there was a $19,000 payment to the appraiser. So that's, so it did, there is criminal activity out there. So a lot of the time things we ran into back then, you had the FBI was involved, and sometimes they would come to us and they said, you don't do anything, we're handling this. When we get through with them, you can have what's left. So that was kind of the mindset, and a lot of times those got surrendered as part of their agreement with the FBI. In other words, they just said, as part of taking this plea bargain, you're giving up your appraisal license. So that wasn't frequent, but it did happen. I remember coming down here to Charlotte and going to they wanted me and the other investigator to come look at reports, and I said, I've never had an armed guard give me a escort to the restroom. That's how secure the FBI office is. If you need to go to the restroom, you let somebody know, and they will walk you down there. So that's a little. I was glad I only had to do that one time.
No?
Yes.
Can you talk a little bit about how the GSC complaints have evolved since we first started doing it?
Yeah, and like I mentioned, we have seen their process get a little more, like they must be checking them a little closer because they seem to be a little more valid in terms of, and when I say valid, some of the very first ones we would see, if any of you worked in rural North Carolina, something looks like a manufactured home with a 2-story addition on the side of it is not that uncommon in our state. And we had one, they sent in the complaint, and I remember, I think it was Randy was the investigator, but he went up and looked at it, and the guy actually had 2 of his 4 comps had mobile homes with 2-story additions on the end of them, and now they were like 20 miles away, which is what Fannie was upset about, but we were like, what do you expect? I mean, this is not a common property. So, I mean, that was the kind that we were looking at and saying, he did the best he could with what he had. Matter of fact, I talked to the director in Kentucky, and he said they had somebody got a complaint about, Fannie complaint with 9, that did a log cabin, and they had 9 log cabin comparables. They said they wanted to give them a commendation, and they were wanting to, because if you've got this much data on that complicated a property. So that was like the very first iteration of some of the, so then, so we started wondering, are we just opening complaints because, there's a couple of parameters here, and it's not falling within the guidelines of Fannie Mae, and then they're just kicking it to the board, and now we're stuck with it. But then we, as we watched a few more cycles of complaints come in, we started realizing, look, we are either finding the issue they're pointing out, or we're finding additional USPAP issues as the staff, and of course our oversight, which is the appraisal subcommittee. I mentioned them reviewing our program today. They come in, and part of their requirements is not only do you look at the complaint for what the complainant said, but you have to look for general USPAP compliance. So if we find something beyond what was in the actual complaint, we still are supposed to point it out and deal with it. So we were seeing some of that. So the board was concerned. I know we got the concern from many appraisers out there. Well, is this truly a signed complaint because it was from an entity, not an individual? Was it, are they actual real complaints, issues we need to deal with, or are they just like, because, they're hard appraisals and they're kind of holding them to an unreal standard. But over time, we looked at it, we took it to what we have a predetermination committee, and they talked about it. And at the end of the day, the board's obligation is to protect the public, and we didn't see how you could just throw them in the trash can and be protecting the public. And so that's why we do look at all of them and we do open them and get a response from the appraiser. And I will say, I talked with the subcommittee and our review, and they did tell us the one difference in how we treat those and others is the Fannie Mae, Freddie Mac, those people are not considered a unknowledgeable complainant. I mean, if a consumer's not happy with an appraisal, they don't, maybe they know nothing about the appraisal process. They're just not happy with the result. And so we kind of owe it to them to be, look it over and say, you have valid concerns, you don't have valid concerns, or whatever. With Fannie and Freddie, if there's items in there that they don't point out and we don't dig extremely deep to try to find additional items or see if there were additional items, we've been told by the subcommittee we've still done our job. We don't have to quite. So we're trying to do some of them a little more on the surface level and say, look, is there something to what they've brought to our attention? And if we see nothing just on that initial, then it's going to probably go away fairly quickly. So that's the one difference in how those are treated than, say, again, a consumer or somebody that has no knowledge of the process.
We started seeing more sign on it.
They signed a batch that dealt with improper use of terms, and it appeared they came from a different entity within Fannie, and so they were actually signing. What I'm talking about is certain phrases and language used in your appraisal report that violated, fair housing or bias or whatever. And I mean, we've heard, just for an example, and I know some of you probably seen in classes, heard these examples. Like I was talking to another state, and they said we had somebody got cited for using the word church in the appraisal report, and the name of the road that the subject property was on was something Church Road. So every time he put the address in there, it was flagging it in the software. So obviously that's not a perfect system yet. And obviously there's certain words that are, that are just common use terms that you can't quite get out. But you do, I think it's a positive that we're making appraisers aware of phrases and terms that shouldn't be used, but it's also, there's some reasonableness that has to be, what was the word gentrification, I think is a word that's been coming up a lot, and it's like, that's in the Appraisal Institute dictionary of appraisal terms. So right or wrong, if I'm the appraiser and I'm sitting there and I'm using the book, what's considered the book of terms that I can use, and then I get cited for it, that's kind of, so all those things I'm sure will have to be revisited at time. And the one that I'll talk about, these complaints just a little bit, is we saw, and we've taken this into account, a complaint filed in 23 on an appraisal done in 21 and guidance that came out in 22. So just for example, I don't know if that was those dates. But if you didn't tell somebody that not to use that term until 22 and they used it in 21, then there's not a whole lot we can say to that appraiser at that point. And I mean, obviously, if it's a term that you can't use, then that's according.
How many of the complaints from Fannie and Freddie are coming from a year or two prior to the effective date, or the board that have complaints coming out?
All of them.
All of them.
Yeah. I mean, because you got to realize Fannie doesn't get involved usually right at the beginning of the process. So it's usually at the point of about going to have a buyback by the bank or whatever, and so that's kind of when we see a lot of them. And they do seem, and I have I don't know enough about their process to say this for certainty, other than just kind of anecdotally, I can see it. It appears like they focus on like regions, and then all of a sudden we'll get several in a certain area, and then we'll see some pop up, you know, in another part of the state.
But during our investigation, we do look to see what kind of education's been taken since the complaint effective date. And we also look to see if there was other complaints that maybe they had a conditional dismissal with and was required to take a class or something and had already gotten a warning or something about that same issue. So we don't like double ding.
Yeah.
Okay.
So if you got a conditional dismissal in 23, and then we gave you a class, and then we get a complaint on an appraisal, kind of had the same issue in 22, we know that you didn't have the class yet, so try to take that into account in whatever recommendation. Or we feel, you're off. I don't know where my feedback's coming. All right, well, any other questions about complaints, how that works, anything about it?
You have to do
And I'll still do some,
renewals.
yeah, okay, and just, so, yeah, I just want to mention renewals real quick. So this year is the use PAP cycle in terms of renewals. You have to have your 2024-25 use PAP class by May 31st in order to renew on time. Most of you probably have it already, so, but that is the requirement for this year. Next year, of course, you'll have to have the whole 28 hours, including the use PAP class. So that's a requirement by May 31st next year. And again, going back to the rules we're putting in today, there will be a requirement beginning 2025 to 27. That cycle, you'll have to have a 7-hour class in fair housing and appraisal bias. And again, that's a new requirement from the AQB. So, but that's, you know, just a reminder, if you don't have your class done by May 31st, you will not be able to renew on time. You will have to wait until July 1, and your license will actually lapse, and you'll have to pay the $10 late fee. You may be, depending on how busy we are that week, you may be issued the afternoon of July 1st, you may be issued July 2nd. You know, obviously there's a holiday right in there, so given the weekend, the holiday, you know, you could be the 5th or 6th getting your license. So, you know, it can cause people a lot of disruption when reports need to go out and you know, somebody's issued you an order. You know, they may say, we can't have your license. Like, how many of you have had a AMC or a lender or somebody about a month before the licenses are expired? They say, we need your renewal, we need your new pocket card, we need to see your current. Well, they're wanting to make sure they're not going to have that gap in there. So sometimes it can be pretty serious to have that day or two. All right, I'm going to hand it over to Brandy for a little bit, and I will still take questions on any of these issues toward the end, but I just let her cover her stuff. All right.
Okay. Well, does anybody have any questions about the 7-hour use path and then next year's CE before I start?
The fair housing and bias class, next year, 2025, everybody has to take 7 hours.
Right.
After that, you have to take 4 hours every other year.
It'll be a
cycle.
7 hours, and so let me just cover it all real briefly. There's an 8-hour class of 7 hours with an exam for new licensees, so new trainees, people who've never been licensed before will have to take a 7-hour class, kind of the history of fair housing, how we got here, the issues with redlining in the 40s and 50s and things like that. So that course has to be taken before you become a trainee, and it includes a 1-hour exam. So it's kind of like a pre-licensing class, even though it technically doesn't meet the definition of pre-licensing, but it will be part of your requirements to get a credential. Everybody, all of us that are licensed or certified, will have to have that course the first 2 years without the exam. So in other words, the same 7-hour course, the history or the background of the fair housing laws and things, that will be that first 25 to 20, in North Carolina, 25 to 27 cycle. Beyond that, then it will be a 4-hour requirement that'll come out every, and we would expect it to follow along the lines of use, but what's important in the fair housing and bias arena, that will be what the outline will be made up of going forward. So from 27 to 29, 29 to 31, that'll be a 4-hour requirement beyond the first cycle. And of course, you still have your use PAP. So given in the 25-27 cycle, you'll have 14 hours of mandated requirement and 14 hours of elective. After that, you'll have 11 and 17.
Any other questions? So this past month, I've gotten 3 or 4 kind of questions and concerns from some trainees, which applies to all appraisers, not just trainees. So I thought I would talk about that, and it has to do with record-keeping requirements and then signing up on logs. So there's been some instances where people have called in because their supervisor hasn't been signing off on their log and they can't submit it for approval. That or they're not being able to get access to their work file. And this could put both the supervisor and the trainee in an unwanted position, or if there's like the relationship severed at all for any reason, either unexpectedly or on poor terms or anything like that. But for the trainee, it can have devastating side effects. So this is a real life example. There was a supervisor appraiser that fell ill and ended up passing away. They had not been signing off on the trainee's logs on a monthly basis. They intended to do so at the very end before they submitted their exam application. They also maintained custody of the entire work files on their home computer, which the trainee did not have access to, and they had no agreement to get access to it. So effectively, the trainee was unable to document any experience for any hours because they weren't signed by the trainee, the supervisor. They didn't have access to the work files. And so their whole time that they've been working with the supervisors just basically wasted. And while that could be a very rare case, and an extreme example, it does happen. Computers can malfunction. There's a natural disaster that can take out your work file and destroy it. There could be other things beyond your control that would leave you without being able to even give it to a board if there was a complaint. So if you are a trainee, it's important that you maintain your log on a daily basis, on the proper format, and try to get your supervisor to sign off on each page as you do it. It's not a requirement. It's every 30 days is a requirement. And even though you're a trainee, regular appraisers that are already certified or licensed, they still have to maintain a log. It's just a different type of log, and it doesn't have as much information. Also, maintain your own work files. Do it on your own computer. Keep them on paper form somewhere in a secured location. Put them on an external hard drive. Make sure you try to back it up every 30 days or so. This is all best practice, by the way. I'll tell you if it's a minimum requirement, like the 30 days. Another way to protect yourself, if you're working for an employer firm even, or if you're a trainee, is to have some sort of agreement to maintain your work file access. So have like an access agreement for retrieval purposes with that in writing, with your supervisor, with your employer. If a supervisory appraiser or another appraiser that is within a firm, or like the manager of the firm or owner, if they refuse to give you, and they are an appraiser, access to your work file, it is a violation of record keeping and the ethics rule of USPAP. It says that an appraiser having custody of a work file must allow other appraisers with work file obligations related to an assignment appropriate access and retrieval for the purpose of submission to a state appraiser regulatory agency, compliance with due process of law, submission to a duly authorized professional peer reviewer committee, or compliance with retrieval arrangements, which is why it's good to have a document in place. A work file must be made available by the appraiser when required by a state appraiser regulatory agency or due process of law. So if the board were to ask for one for work product or as a complaint, you are required, as long as it's within the record keeping rule, which is the 5 years, or beyond if it was a contested case that went to a hearing.
And even though we can we can go to the supervisor and say, you have to give them access or whatever. If you're not keeping up with it on a continual basis, you don't know what kind of record keeping they're doing. So even if we can force them to give us what they have may not be sufficient, and we don't know it until it's too late to do anything about it.
Right. And then in order for us to even really look into it, unless it's just some courtesy call on your behalf, you would have to file a complaint against the supervisor or the other appraiser so that we could actually investigate it and try to do something about the violation. Do you guys have any questions on logs overall? I wasn't going to get into really how to fill them out, but I can if you want.
Anybody in here a trainee? Okay.
There is that new form that's available that came out that's you're supposed to start using as of January 1st. So as long as you're using the newest format, but you don't have to backdate any reports or anything. Would you guys have any specific questions on the log? Or?
I just been using the one that's on the website. I guess it's the newest one. And yes, it's pretty straightforward so far. So.
Yeah, if you printed a bunch of copies of the older one, you may want to just make sure you have the newer one, but it's the one on the website now. Yeah.
Okay, great.
Okay. The other thing I was going to talk about is competency. So competency can be very complicated. Simply earning you a license does not mean that you're competent to appraise certain types of properties, certain types of methodology. But what it should do when you have a license is give you the ability to know when you are and when you are not competent and where you can go to gain that competency. So USPAP says competency can apply to a variety of factors. For example, you're familiar with a specific type of property or asset, a market, a geographic area, an intended use, specific laws and regulations, or an analytical method. So let's say you just received your certified residential credential, but you never did an income approach. And now all of a sudden you have a duplex property and you have to do the income. This doesn't mean you can't do the appraisal. It also doesn't mean you're competent to do it either if you've never done one. But you should be able to tell the lender, your client, that you've never done one and this is how I'm going to gain competency. You can take a class on it. You can consult with another appraiser. You can enlist the help of somebody who's willing to co-sign the report. If you think about it, how's anyone ever going to be able to appraise anything if they've never been given the chance to learn? Years ago, nobody was familiar with green buildings. You think the first person that got something with the solar panels on it knew what they were doing? Probably not. So you just have to be able to learn. And that kind of also goes back to other experience methods and stuff, like PREA, which some states are having to deal with, and then depending on what type of work you get with your supervisor, what type of work they're willing to give you that they come across, which is also another reason you can do demonstration appraisal reports. So if you have something where you haven't been able to access from a client an income producing property or maybe a certain area that you want to start appraising in, you can do demonstration reports if you're a trainee and use that to get some skills and to gain competency in those specific areas.
And this is something that's been kind of a thing out there for the last 2 or 3 years, especially the whole discussion of PREA, but it really goes beyond that, is we get a lot of people talking about, how can so-and-so, if they get a credential and they're not competent to appraise in the Charlotte market, or they're not competent to appraise in, Highlands, or they're not competent to appraise at, the coast, or they're not, wherever they're not, well, if you look at those credentials we issue, none of them say Highlands, none of them say coast, none of them say Charlotte. They say you're a certified appraiser in the state of North Carolina. And so there's no, if I get my credential today working out in the western part of the state with Dana, and I get issued, and yeah, he wouldn't want to work with me, but anyhow. But if I get issued with him, and then the very next week I go and I'm going to go be Stevens competition out there in Dare County, there is nothing that prohibits that move. Now, does that mean I'm competent? Probably not. I probably do have a learning curve there to deal with, and I have to find out how they do things out there, how certain issues are, dealt with at the coast, what it means to be, whether you're sound front or whether you're beach front or, all these things that probably don't come into play too often in up in Franklin. So we're sitting there and that's an issue. So we talked about earlier, how many out-of-state people do we have? We get a lot of people every week. I probably sign off on more reciprocity applications than I do traditional. And every one of those people, can come in here tomorrow and they're just as certified as those of us that have been here 30 years. And so that's, again, it's not saying that you know how to appraise every property in every area. This goes to property type as well as property location. I've been a certified general appraiser for 24 years. If I get an order to go do Bank of America Stadium over here in downtown Charlotte, I don't even know where to start. I wouldn't even know where to start putting the tape to measure it. but what I'm saying is that's, but I've got a certification that says I'm allowed to do that assignment. It doesn't say I'm able to do it. So you do have to, and the same thing, and that's the idea behind PREA, and I'm going to get on that soapbox, but just to say, is to show that you have the tools to know, okay, I know what I do know and I know what I need to know in order to tackle different assignment types. And so that's why it's, we'll never have it where we have a lot of people that when they upgrade, the only thing they've ever done is tract-built homes in neighborhoods where every home, the garage is on the left on this one and the right on this one, and they get a ton of experience doing very simple homes with a lot of comparables available. And there's nothing wrong with that. I mean, that's experience, that's work that needs to be done, and it is a good way to kind of get into the repetition of how to do it. But it certainly doesn't mean that they know how to do a berm house or a geodesic dome or, solar panels or whatever. So just, be aware that competency, it's appraisal practice. You do it, you learn over time. What did you do in the last 6 months that you've never done before that you now know I have to deal with it this way? Or you found something out in your public records at your particular county or municipality. That's the way they do things here. Then that may not be the way they did things where you were previously. So all that comes into play with competency. And I think we just have people that think, you have to be trained and competent in the area that you're going to work. And that's just not the case.
No, it's not. I mean, it could be things like environmental contamination, which is covered under Advisory Opinion 9, local laws and regulations, or it could be subsidized housing. You may not be able to do subsidized housing, but you can do all other types because you're not familiar with those laws and regulations. But it doesn't mean you can't learn them. You just need to be able to find out how you're going to learn them and make sure you report it to your client up front. The other thing with the demonstration reports I'll go into is if you're going to use demonstration reports, it's up to 25% of your experience credit. So depending on the level you're going for, you get 25%. Your supervisor still has to oversee you doing it if you're a trainee. Your supervisor has to sign the report. I recommend not using a lending form because you're not doing it for lending purposes. You should use like a general purpose form or do a narrative format. The board would be your client. The intended use would be for demonstration work experience. And try to do it where you can gain competency in a certain area. That way you can take the methods that you applied during your training on all those qualifying education courses and put it into real life examples, which will also help you with any exams you're having to do it whenever you try to upgrade. Because you'll be able to correlate how it gets related into the appraisal.
And it is acceptable for the training to create an appraisal review as part of that, under that demonstration 25% umbrella. So.
Yes. But it would still be counted as a demonstration, so it would be the 25%, not the review, which is capped at 50. Yes.
So you could do 25 demonstration reviews, 25 actual reviews, and 50 appraisals. So it's that makes it.
Well, not actual numbers, it's hours.
Well, I mean,
Yeah,
percentages.
yeah.
So yeah, that's another thing that I'll mention. One of the biggest problems we see with upgrades is not the training not being acknowledged in the report itself. And that is one thing that we check for on every assignment. So we're looking to make sure that the trainee was properly acknowledged. Either they co-signed the report or they were said they provided significant assistance and kind of gave a description of what they did.
Yeah, and this
So-
doesn't mean you can just add it after the fact when we select it. It
Yeah.
has to be what you submitted to the client. What you submitted to the client has to have your name in it.
It doesn't need to be a separate sheet of paper that has one line that John Doe assisted in the preparation of this report. It could be just ripped off and, because that's probably what happened. So, it needs to be, it really should be in the certification. We are a little, because of the way the Fannie Mae certification works and it's not to be altered and stuff, there is like a supplemental addendum and things that people put in and if it's in there, we will allow it. But that is probably the biggest thing where people lose credit.
It is, yeah, for sure. And if there's something weird that we're seeing it in an odd spot, we may reach out to the appraisal management company or to the client and ask them for a copy of it just to make sure it was that way when it was sent to them. Typically, we take your word for it, but sometimes we do have to double check just when stuff seems off. Also, we're claiming exaggerated hours sometimes, or with a lot of drive time. Sometimes we have to disallow, or when there's more than one trainee listed as providing significant assistance. Since the rule says you have to do at least 75% of the work, you can't have 2 trainees listed on the log in the with report because you can't both get 75% because that equates to 150. So that also is what limits a lot of people from getting hours. Or we have to disallow them because they started doing work before their supervisor declaration was in. And then looking back, the supervisor wasn't eligible or some other reason.
And we do have to tie experience to a USPAP compliant report, whether it be an appraisal report or review. But you don't, so we do have sometimes people will say, well, I started on it and the client canceled it midway. Can I claim those hours? And the answer is no, you can't. We have to have
Or if they're just doing a re-inspection or something like that, that can't count if they're not producing an actual report afterwards with it.
And just you brought up the term drive time. This is probably one of the most misinterpreted things, but let's just say, okay, we're here in Charlotte. I get an assignment to go to Hickory. So it's about, an hour and 15 minutes, something like that to get there. Well, the hour and 15 minutes to get to Hickory, it should not be counted as part of your experience. Once you get there, if you're, driving the neighborhood, looking at the comparables, doing things like that, and you say you spend from the time you arrive in Hickory till the time, you leave, basically, and you spend, a total of, 30 minutes at the inspection, and driving the comps, it takes another 45, and then you drive and look at what's in the general market area. That kind of drive time counts. But that windshield time from here to back and forth would not count, because we do see people.
And that comes from the Appraisal Foundation's AQB criteria. You have to have spent time on the actual appraisal process.
Right.
And so commuting time doesn't
So
count.
evaluating the market area is part of the appraisal process. Just driving up and down the highway is not.
Do you guys have any questions on competency or how we evaluate experience through the log or?
Yeah, I have a question. So for the certified general hours, is a certain number of those hours you can be allocated to doing commercial, or is it just output?
At least 1,500 has to be in commercial work. You can have all 3,000, yeah, or you can have all 3,000, or you can have at least 1,500, but you can't have less than 1,500 in general. And if you're already a residential, you could count your appraising hours as yourself for residential that you've been doing, but if you're just a trainee, it's all at least 1,500.
Do they have to go back and do their other signed logs in the new form? Or
No.
can they? Okay.
Just as of January 1st, it should be on the new form, and any old forms still count.
So if the trainee is doing reviews on commercial properties, and in your review, then that's commercial credit. And in my case, demonstration of that 25%.
Right, so if you did a demo of a commercial property, it can count in the commercial bucket, and if it counts as residential, it would count in the, right, exactly.
And there's some extreme complex residentials that can sometimes count towards general experience too, that's not.
Like a subdivision analysis of the whole, putting in the subdivision, even though it's a residential subdivision, that's considered commercial assignment. Or mixed use, you see a lot in this area and in the Raleigh area, you have like residential up above and retail or office below. Those are complex, those are commercial type assignments. And if you just have one condo unit upstairs, that would be a residential unit. So if you have if you're doing the whole complex,
Yeah.
that would be.
So when you talk about whether the supervisor must accompany the trainee in the production, creation of an appraisal or demonstration report.
So it depends, I guess, well, on going with them? What do you mean going with them?
Right, in terms of the inspection, as you know. there's-
So you don't have to do an inspection on a review necessarily unless that's part of your scope of work.
Right.
So you could have just a regular desktop, or you could have a hybrid approach. But if it was the first 50, that still would apply. So if it's the first 50 reports or the first 1,500 hours, whichever comes first, if the review scope of work had an inspection, it was still within the first like 10 reports they were doing, then the supervisor would have to go on the inspection, yes.
So since it's a demonstration report, then the supervisor would make the determination as to whether the scope of work is used.
Because you may not be able to do an inspection.
Right,
but
and
if
if
you
you're
just
ju-
found a vacant.
If you're just going to do it as a desktop review, then there wouldn't be an inspection. But if an inspection's required, or if you deem it's required as part of the demo, then yeah, they would have to. So that's just, it doesn't, that's one thing people kind of get mixed up sometimes is, we're not saying you have to go on so many inspections, like if inspections aren't part of your scope of work. We're just saying that if an inspection's required, then the first so many, they have to be accompanied.
So the appraisal reviews are acceptable if an inspection is not part of the.
It's not the scope, you're right. Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of reviews that are just done on a desktop basis.
And it's not the first 50 reports that have to have an inspection. It's the first 50 that require an inspection is the scope of work that the trainee does.
Right.
So.
So if you do, let's say you do 50,
Yeah.
you do 50 assignments, and 20 of them required an inspection, 30 of them didn't. Well, you haven't met the requirement. In other words, you haven't met 50 inspections, you've only met 20. So on 51, if it requires an inspection, you still have to go, because that's only 21 inspections, that's 51 assignments. So,
And so you would have to go by the 1,500 hours, which means they should have been on all the inspections if it was upgraded to certified residential.
Right.
So in my case, these are closed out, eminent domain reports, and.
If you're not saying we're going to go back and re-inspect, we're just going to review them desktop, then they don't require it.
Yeah.
But then if they get into their real assignments, their appraisal assignments, they won't have met any of that, and they'll have to get it they'll have to do it on the back end, so to speak. And then, as a lot of you are aware, the rules that got held up because Perea also included cutting that number from 50 to 25. And so as of the end of December, if nothing else changes in the legislature, December of 25, 19 months from now, then you won't have to go on but 25 inspections instead of 50.
Intermittent 50 miles.
and removing the 50 mile rule.
50 mile rule, is that from the supervisor's office?
Supervisor's primary location. So if you have a supervisor and they say, well, I have offices in Charlotte, Raleigh, and Asheville, well, fine, but you had to pick one. And that's the one that's shown as your primary address in the Raleigh office, in our office. And so if you said, and if that's where your credentials issued, then if it's farther than that, then yeah. So, and again, you have to come up with somewhere to put the pin in the ground. So somebody, we've heard people say, well, they claim Raleigh is their office, and they do most of their work in Charlotte. Well, we don't get, you pick one. Once you pick one, then that's where we're operating from. So we're not trying to, we've had people say, can I supervise somebody from, I'm dual licensed in North Carolina and Florida. Yeah, but every one of those is over 50 miles if you're in Florida. So, you just kind of, but, so we've had people try to get very creative in how they try to interpret that. But I'm like, there's no way you can interpret Florida's closer than 50 miles. So, and I think there's been ample guidance from the AQB or the ASB on this, is that, if you say I did a personal inspection, that is not drone inspection, that is not, we had a guy that said, well, I looked at everything on Google Maps and I looked at everything, so I inspected it, or he took the training walk through with their iPhone on video. That's not, as all of us that have done this a while know, you can avoid a lot of things with the camera if you want to. So that's not considered a personal inspection. So if you say I personally inspected or a personal inspection was required, then you've not done it just because you looked at photos.
Any other questions? Any of that, or a different topic even?
So the 50 miles is December,
The end of 25.
the end of 25.
If nothing changes.
If nothing changes with what the rules, it's part of the rules that got delayed.
Yeah.
So
Once
once,
the end of 25.
right, and just so you know why people have asked, well, aren't y'all going to try to move it up? Or it looked very unlikely that there would be any movement on it in the short session. Just would almost probably couldn't tie it to anything that they would be considering in the short session. And then, discussing it with some appraisal organizations and others, by the time it got any traction in the 25 legislative session, we'd almost be there. And all you do then is open up the can of worms for the people that were objecting to it to try to change it some more. And so,
What were they objecting to, that, or what it was tied to?
yeah. I mean, the bottom line is, it just didn't seem like and for those of you that don't know, I mean, the board's interpretation right now is, if you get let's say South Carolina, you go to South Carolina, you get your certification through Perea in South Carolina, you can come in the next day through reciprocity, because there's no requirement against that. But it's just to try and get it changed, to get ours moved. There's a lot of hard to understand why delaying it did anything. I know that people were concerned, well, we haven't seen one yet, and within a month after all this happened, there was one up and running. So, why are we waiting? We're waiting this long. But
I will say, if they come in through reciprocity, through Perea from another state, we don't know that. We verify the credential. We don't know how the other state issued it. So there's no way for us to track that.
There's no checkbox that says it was Perea
Yeah.
versus a traditional business.
Correct.
Yeah, yeah.
And we don't even, reciprocity doesn't even go necessarily like appraiser to appraiser, it's state by state.
yeah. Right.
So, different topic.
Sure.
Yeah.
So, now, when we were in DC last, there was a lot of discussion around upzoning
Yeah.
and how that's affecting residential appraisal in different markets.
Right.
Have y'all had anything come up about that or any pockets of that in North Carolina that has been an issue?
I have not heard of any to date. Now, I fully expect, like, based on what we were hearing, that it could happen at any time. But I have not, and for those of you that are not familiar with the term upzoning is like, let's say that the density in a specific area would only allow a single family residence, or it only allow a 2 to 4 family, and now they're saying, okay, it can hold 6, 8, whatever, small, basically a small apartment type situation, or a double duplex or whatever, and which would, and of course the idea is to try to provide more housing opportunities, and especially in urban areas. So, I mean, I haven't heard anybody talking about it as a concern yet, but how that's going to, and what does that do to property value, especially if you're doing rentals now that you're getting 8 rents instead of 4, or you're getting, but I'm sure it's something that will rear its head sooner than later. I think some of the Northwest states like Oregon, Washington, Oregon, that area is a little more prevalent now. I think even in Northern Virginia, outside of DC, that they're starting to, those type of areas first. I think a lot of what I was hearing, Graham, tell me if you heard it differently, but I think a lot of the politicians making some of these calls aren't thinking about all the ramifications down the line for property value. And so,
For looking at affordable housing, but also how do you appraise or finance those when certain living types are tied to single family
Right.
dwelling, and now you all of a sudden have 8 on property?
yeah, now you got eight on property, and
Residential people.
yeah, and then the other big topic is more where accessory dwelling units are allowed, and what does that mean, and so
How many tiny homes can you put around
yeah.
the front yard?
Well, I mean, there's and literally, I know in Rocky Mount, which is about an hour east of Raleigh, there is a tiny home resort, and they're built like in a circle around a lake or something, and people are renting them, for weekends or whatever. Well, it sounds kind of cool, but now what if somebody takes their 50 acres in their backyard and does that same concept, and now people are living in them, and you've got basically a small village, and now it's not a bunch of people there for their Valentine weekend. It's people there that are just, that's where they are, and so and not saying there's anything wrong with it, just what's the ramifications in terms of taxes, property values, the individual, are they going to be individual lots? Is it going to be one lot with all these different dwellings on it? Again, then you get into whole issues with septic, sewer. I mean, it just, the more you sit here and think about it, it just perpetuates itself. And I think, unfortunately, that the people that were making some of these laws, none of that was discussed. It was just, how do we get more homes on a smaller lot size.
On that too, like, right?
Yeah. Yeah. So.
Well, I'll stay around for a little bit if somebody has a question they don't
Yeah,
want to
I mean,
ask
we-
in front of everybody or something.
We don't have to bust out the door, but it's about 2:50. We were going to try to go to 3. So if you need to head on, feel free to go. If you're, we appreciate everybody coming. We'll be glad to, like I said, both our emails, mine's don@ncab.org and Brandy's is brandy@ncab.org. So
What's
if
the
you-
lie?
If you didn't want to ask a question today, feel free to do so by email. We'll try to answer it as timely as we can. Certainly, if you're dealing with an upgrade yourself or somebody in your office is dealing with an upgrade, if they have questions, we deal with those every day. So we're glad to try to. We'd rather help before you turn the application in and try to fix it than we are to. It's easier on the front end.
Definitely.
Thank you.
Thank you all.